following on, for the great thing about Mark is that when he and I both work on some pretty similar subjects like road verges, and yet his approach is really quite radically different from mine, but we both end up in the same place. And I think what that speaks to is the diversity of approaches that can all help wildlife on our verges, in our public spaces, and indeed in our gardens. Now, I'm Phil Sterling. My background is that, apart from being an ecologist, is for 25 years I was the principal ecological advisor at Dorset County Council, now Dorset Council, and during my time there, had many schemes in which I was involved in the creation and management of large areas for wildlife, particularly to do with mineral and waste site restorations, but also road verges and other major developments. And for the last 4 years of my tenure at the County Council, I was neatly put in charge of road verge maintenance at the council. So if there were complaints, they came to me. So I was in charge of the machinery, the staff, the contracts, and for the first time ever, I think, somebody had wisely put an ecologist in charge of road verge management. And so I was then able, as the leader, to be able to put in place those things that had frustrated me and no doubt frustrate many of you when you look at road verges and when you look at a picture as on this first slide, which is fairly typical local government management of road verges and of public spaces, is that as we've gone on, we've got less and less money to spend on managing our open spaces, our amenity grasslands, and so we cut them a little less frequently normally than we used to, and we end up with these clods of brown rotting grass, and it's nothing very appealing or attractive about it. And yet we're kind of locked into this process where we've created this stuff, we just have to keep managing it for all sorts of reasons, to keep it looking nice, to keep the road verges safe and functioning, the safety critical areas, a range of reasons why we keep it. But in the meantime, they're delivering virtually no biodiversity. And that's the sad bit. And that's the bit where I came in as the ecologist into road verge management to change all that. So I think it's pretty obvious that we would all really rather prefer that, which is a very equivalent piece of green space that has basically been transformed into kind of mini nature reserves in these sort of little urban settings, these bits of green space. And what I'm going to do just now is to tell you about that story and see where the opportunities that you may be able to take in your areas to emulate some of what I managed in my 4 years of looking after road verges and indeed the whole of the countryside service, so that the practices that you will see now, we spread out across all of our parks and open spaces where those had previously been just gang mown grasslands. So this whole talk is about how do we change wherever we gang mow grassland, how can we change the outlook to make it more permeable, particularly for wildflowers, because once we're there, then we've got our pollinators that are able to come in and feast on the benefits. So these days, and in a slightly different context to the way Mark showed you, we want a lot out of our urban green spaces. We want them to do much more than just look green and be tidied and mown. So here are some of those benefits that we're expecting. These are the kind of ecosystem benefits, if you like, that we expect of our green spaces. And I think what we have probably not really realized is that actually by getting one or two of these aligned, all the others tend to fall into place. So if we manage positively for biodiversity, for more pollinators, then we will automatically deal with some of the other issues, particularly in terms of carbon offsetting. We create a sense of place. So if everywhere we visit just is gang mown grassland, it never takes on the characters of the geology underneath. It never takes on the characteristics of the wildlife that's local to that area. So you never really know whether you're I don't know, in an open space in northern Britain or in southern Britain, because it's just gang mown ryegrass. The point about this is getting these things aligned enables you to manage for multiple benefits through one main aim. And my main aim was to improve biodiversity. The one thing we do know, and Mark's already mentioned it, is that soil fertility is a powerful driver of grass growth. So in these two pictures, you've got the same stretch of road verge, just 100 metres apart. This is just down the road from me where I'm sat at the moment in Weymouth. And this is a verge pictures taken in April, and the standard 150 mil of topsoil was placed on the area on the left, and my engineering colleagues had run out of the stuff by the time they got to the picture on the right. So they dressed it with anything they've got, any bits of subsoil and anything, and spread it out, sowed the same amenity grass mix on top and left it. On the left, you can see that even by mid-April, you've got the grass halfway up the lamppost. It needs managing in order to maintain the safety and integrity of the highway. That grass has got to be mown. On the right, thin topsoil, low fertility soils, still green, no need for any mowing at all. You've effectively given yourself a month, maybe 2 months, without any need for management at all. Where on the left, with the thick topsoil, you've created yourself a burden forever. But look a little more closely. On the left, what have we got? A couple of dandelions and a daisy, about it. On the right, masses of daisies, and there's loads of celandines, and a quick look further in there and you'll see a range of different common herbs in that grass sward. Basically, when you reduce the fertility of the ground, the grass still grows, but it tends to be different species of grass. They tend to be lower growing, and you end up with more spaces for germination for wildflowers. And these may be very common wildflowers, but they don't have to be. And that is effectively all you need to know about changing fertility, is as you reduce fertility, the grass grows less, but you increase the biodiversity automatically. And that is the way nature has designed it in our northwest European grasslands. In fact, over most of Europe, this happens. It's a bit different in southern Europe, and it is a bit different in the New World. But in our part of the world, this is very much the system where the lower the fertility of the soil, the higher the plant diversity, and on the back of that, the higher the invertebrate biodiversity that's on there. And the reason for that is that the coarse grasses and the hogweeds and the ragworts and the docks, thistles, they can't compete because their strategy for life is about sucking up nutrients really quickly and growing very, very fast, producing lots of leaves and flowers and seeds, and then dying off. Whereas our wildflowers, the ones we cherish the most, are the ones that are able to tolerate low nutrient levels. And so they're very good at scavenging what's available. And they're all out there competing for what little is available, and they all end up surviving to a greater or lesser extent. So you end up low nutrients, high biodiversity. And of course, it's the kind of antithesis of farming, really, isn't it? But it's something, it's a process, it's an ecological principle that we can adapt beautifully for the management of our amenity grasslands, whether that's road verges or public parks, or indeed our very own gardens for those who have them. But there are financial consequences of low fertility, and you'll have already gathered that from my second slide. Because if we can control the amount that the grass grows in the first place, we'll have less to cut. Less to cut, mowing should cost us less, and we can spend more time, more effort on doing, well, dare I say it, more important jobs than mowing grass, probably, I think. So in principle, lower cost maintenance and higher biodiversity on amenity grasslands should align. But the point is, does this actually work in practice? You know, it's fine some boffin out of a university like me coming to tell you that, but does it work in practice? And I think the great thing that I had a chance to do was to show it. So best place to do this is under construction. Now, I recognize for most of us, we've got existing amenity grasslands all over the country. This is not the place to start playing with dinky toys and creating things. But every now and again, opportunities will arise. So learn what you can achieve by getting in there early in the design process, because this helps you understand just how far you can go when it comes to manipulating existing amenity grasslands. So, you know, it's lovely. When you're working in southern England on chalk, it's an amazing place to be because it's so low fertility. Wildflowers love it. But it's true of any soil anywhere. The lower the fertility, the higher the wildflower diversity. So what I did was to allow no more than a fraction of the normal amount of topsoil. Normally 150 mil would be sprayed all over and smeared all over that verge, 15 mil only, or none at all. So only subsoil. And then onto that, basic wildflower mix suitable for the area. And all of these are what I call these stress tolerator wildflowers. So these are ones whose whole life strategy is about being able to tolerate low nutrient conditions to be able to survive long term in that, you know, denutrified environment. And that's what we want. But it also includes one or two other species that I call pioneer species because they flower, they germinate and flower very, very quickly. As soon as the bare ground, a little bit of dampness and warmth, the flowers, the seeds are germinating and on they're going. One of those, and this is just 18 months after the road opened, this is kidney vetch. Kidney vetch should be a very, very widespread flower across the UK. It's found from the west tip of Cornwall all the way up to, well, it's certainly in the Outer Hebrides. It's certainly all the way across to John O'Groats. I imagine it's out in the Northern Isles too. But it's a wonderful flower. It's fabulous nectar for pollinators, and sadly, it's being lost in our landscape. Well, not if we include it in the wildflower mixes in our amenity areas, in urban areas. It flowers profusely, particularly if you give it bare ground. But it is a very important species, and there are plenty of those rare bees now confined to bumblebees confined to northern Britain and Scotland that are that depend upon this flower as one of their principal nectar sources. But in my part of the world, in butterfly conservation land, one of the key butterflies that we're interested in conserving is the small blue butterfly. That again is found from southern England all the way up to northeast Scotland, and its sole food plant are the flowers and developing seeds of kidney vetch. So this is a really important species. It's in decline, but it shouldn't be. We have it in our power, in our capability, in our urban landscapes to be able to do something very significant for this little butterfly. And indeed, the 7 hectares of the Weymouth Relief Road that were created back in 2010 now support probably the largest colony of this butterfly anywhere in southern Britain. I mean, there are clouds of them every year. So it's easy to do, and it's an extraordinarily successful opportunity for recreating biodiversity. Now, this is the same road verge last summer. Look how it's matured and changed from what it was in that 2013. So, and I sowed it in 2010. So last summer, we were looking at carpets of pyramidal orchids. And the season before, there were a whole load of bee orchids. And this is what can happen. So this seed was sown onto bare clay subsoil. So this was a sort of a calcareous clay, very soggy, claggy stuff. So it's not that rich chalk that you look at. This is just kind of sticky muck, really. But 10 years on, it's absolutely fabulous. And the plant survey that we had most recently in 2019, of the whatever it was, just under 30 species of seed that I'd sown on there, now 141 different plant species. And now recorded across these 7 hectares of verges, 30 species of butterfly. And for the nerds amongst you, you will know that of the 59 species of butterfly that we have in this country, that means those road verges are now supporting 30 species of butterfly. That's over half the British list, and the site is barely 10 years old. So that's remarkable, and this will be true of wherever we can create our own amenity grasslands full of wildflowers. We have the capacity to be able to bring back biodiversity at massive scale if we get it right. Now let's just go back to that middle picture again with all the orchids. How often has that been maintained? How often has it been cut and managed? It hasn't. That verge that you're looking at in the foreground has had no mowing. The last person to stand on that verge was me sowing the seed back in 2010. That's it. So potentially there's this enormous saving in what we have to do, which is to go out there and cut grass all the time. We're not trying to be farmers, we're trying to create biodiversity. If we create the landscape that these wildflowers thrive in, we can also save ourselves a lot of money. And just in case you're worried, for those as we're looking in Scotland, Northern Marsh orchid is the equivalent roadside and kind of amenity grassland orchid that I would say we should be desperately trying to get more of in throughout Scotland. It's a relatively widespread species and is certainly prevalent on road verges, and indeed, leading into Glasgow, some of the arterial roads have got good populations of Northern Marsh orchid. But it's a species that we should be able to create in the sort of abundance that you're looking at in the slide. So, not only are we able to think about reduction of costs associated with management, but there are other matters. And I said, get your ecosystem services lined up and other things start to follow. And one of those is greenhouse gas emissions. Because if you think about the design of the Weymouth Relief Road with no topsoil on it, we had no cost associated with carting the loads of topsoil and spreading it with a machine onto the slopes. And since created, we've got no management that we're going on. So if you look at a whole life cycle in terms of the fuel use and convert that into greenhouse gas emissions, you can see just how much in that whole of life cycle that you're able to save. And this work was done by a colleague I was working with in ADAS, Dr. Sarah Wynne, who is an agricultural specialist, but able to turn her hand to looking at by how much greenhouse gases do we save by using this low fertility, low nutrient soil approach. And if we looked at a standard maximum amount of management that might be required on the Weymouth Relief Road, had we designed it according to the 150 mil of topsoil and amenity grass mix. So we would have put the topsoil down there. That's the equivalent in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of the dark blue bar in the bar chart. And then we will have gone out and we will have mown those verges, say, twice a year. But every time we go out there, we're using more fuel and we can estimate the greenhouse gas emissions. Compare that with the bar on the far right, which is the low topsoil approach. And if you compare those two, that's a 97% reduction in the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And that is extremely significant. Now, I've also given another version of the savings in the middle, which is a mowing of those verges once every 3 or 4 years. And that achieves somewhere in the region of about an 87% saving in greenhouse gas emissions. So I think what we do want to do is we've got an awful lot of green space that we've already got covered with topsoil, and then we have to go and do this too. On a frequent basis, we have to go out and mow it. Now, local government is out there trying to reduce the amount of mowing that's going on, and indeed there's public pressure to do so because we think it's the right thing to do to encourage wildlife. Well, I've talked to you about the ecosystem already. If you simply reduce the amount of mowing at the same time as leaving the fertility where it is, you end up with longer grass, and that longer grass gets ever more difficult to cut. So there's a bit of a pushback from just stop mowing, and you have to treat and understand amenity grassland as an ecosystem to be able to start managing it properly to benefit not only the pocket but also the pollinators. And what I experimented with my teams in Dorset was to look at cut and collect, because most road verge maintenance all over the country, and indeed most open space maintenance in parks, is done by cut and drop. So we just allow the arisings, the cuttings just to rot where they are, and they return the nutrients to the soil. Those nutrients, of course, go back into the soil and they help to produce more grass the following year. Well, if you cut and remove, cut and lift, take away those arisings, those nutrients that have come up during the growing season and are still there in that nice, tall, lush green grass, they can't go back. You've taken them away. You've swiped them. And that is a really important part of that reducing nutrients on an existing grass sward, is that if you allow that grass to grow long, then take it away, you instantly and automatically change the nature of that grassland to one that is heading towards lower fertility. And we tried out a number of different machines when we were doing our experiments in Dorset back in 2014, 15, 16, and at different scales. Some were repurposed machines that were used, I don't know, on cricket pitches. Others were bespoke. Others we borrowed from a golf course, and yet others, the Rytec flail collector is a fairly standard piece of kit for large areas of grass collection, and we repurposed it and put it out on the road verges. So range of different kit, all pretty much available, and I know Mark will talk to you about kit when he comes back in a wee bit. The process, as far as I have experimented and found successful, is basically to get that fertility down on existing road verges as fast as possible. So reduce the fertility fast through repeated cut and collect, cut and lift in the first year. And my suggestion is to cut and lift 3 times in any 1 year, whenever that is. Now in Southern England, April, July, September are good months to do this. In Northern England and Scotland, that could well be well into May, but again in July and again in September. And if you do that, so you let the grass get really long, cut it, take it away. You look at this picture here, that's that verge, which was created on just ordinary Oxford clay, and sown with amenity grass. So it was cut 3 times in 2017, and you're looking at a photograph in mid-May 2018, no cuts yet. So that verge would always have been cut at the beginning of April, and it doesn't need it in mid-May, 1 year later following cut and collect. Not only that, but you can see instantly that common wildflowers that have started to sprout up and flourish there. So instantly adding a nectar-rich habitat for bees and other invertebrates. And after 3 years of cut and collect, so we've extended our trials. It's going now pretty much over the whole of Dorset's urban verges. So here's a verge after 3 years of cut and collect, and this verge you're looking at was photographed in mid-October, and the last cut on that verge was 26th of June 2019. And it's not brimming with wildflowers, but the point is those wildflowers are starting to get in there, and because you've reduced the fertility, those wildflowers are not growing very tall. You can see some yarrow in the foreground, a few inches tall. It's of no concern from a safety or a look of the site. That site is perfectly tidy, but it's already providing pollinator habitat as without need for any further management. Here's one after 4 years of cut and collect, taken in May 20. Again, a very ordinary, previously very dull road verge in Weymouth. It's now full of rough hawksbeard, oxeye daisy, dandelions, daisies, celandines that have just come in very naturally because the fertility of the soil has been reduced drastically by cut and collect, to the extent that this verge, which used to be cut 4 or 5 times a year, is now cut twice on cut and collect regime, and just flowers, and those flowers just flower, set seed, providing all that nectar, and it's just a wonderful sight on an ordinary road verge in Weymouth. But things get even better the more you do this. And here's a verge after 5 years of cut and collect on the Blandford bypass visibility splays. They used to be cut 3 times a year. They're now on a once only cut a year, and that's a cut and collect. And they're now so good in terms of their botanical diversity that they've been declared as a county wildlife site. So there is an absolute way of being able to save money and deliver more biodiversity. They go hand in hand if you understand grass road verges and parks as a grassland ecosystem and manage for wildflowers. You will save yourselves money at the same time. And back to one of my original shots. Here's which was just a piece of gang mown amenity grass on the edge of Weymouth. We did our 3 cut and lifts in 2017, and then sowed the grass sowed the sward at the end of the year with some very basic wildflowers of oxeye daisies, birdsfoot trefoil, common knapweed, and yellow rattle. 18 months later, those areas have become mini nature reserves. Notice how all of the blacktop and all of the paths and the road verges are then framed with a cut and collect, and that keeps them looking neat and tidy, because it's really important in urban spaces to maintain public support and community buy-in for what's going on. The same can also happen for private lawns and municipal lawns, so areas outside of social housing, for instance, where currently that land is acres and acres of green grass that's gang mown, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I've just put in a wee prescription on the left there of basically for grass that tends to be mown, I don't know, 6 to 10 times a year, you should very quickly be able to get down to 2 to 3 times a year through cut and collect. Wildflowers appear naturally. I mean, here's an example of a lawn in Hampshire. This has never had anything other than cut and collect, and finally persuaded them just to stop mowing for a month or 2. And look at the result. All these wildflowers now coming up there as part of the lawn. You will know that Plant Life have got a No Mow May campaign last year. My suggestion is it should really be No Mow May to August, ideally, because that allows a much greater range of flowering throughout the growing season. And I know it's quite controversial at the minute, but you will know Monty Don has been out there saying cutting grass makes a filthy noise and is about the most injurious thing you can do to wildlife. Yeah, I would agree. Lawns, particularly, very controversial. We all like our nice, neat mown lawn, but it doesn't all have to be that way. And there's a municipal lawn outside social housing in Weymouth, and that's full of birdsfoot trefoil and mousy hawkweed, and that just comes up now while they're cutting and collecting. They don't need to cut as often, and so throughout most of the summer, these flowers are there. Now, just to show you by how much cutting does reduce, my teams were out there cutting 6 times a year on the urban cycle of grass cutting, and there was a provision for a 7th cut in a really wet year. Now, just the cut and collect started in 2017, and here's the log that the staff fill in when they come in of a day and say where they've been mowing. This is at the end of 2018. They have only needed to do 2 cuts in 2018, having up to 2016 they were cutting 5 or 6 times a year. And for those of you who remember, it was a particularly dry year in 2018, certainly throughout most of England. In 2019 they needed 2 or 3 cuts in 2019, but they were back down to 2 in 2020. So effectively a regime that was once built on and financed on the basis of 5 or 6 cuts a year has gone down to 2 or possibly 3 cuts in a matter of 2 years. So this is a remarkable saving in the amount of effort that goes into management. Now, from my point of view, there are some key do's and don'ts that I think we need to get our heads around if we're serious about wanting more insects, more pollinators, more butterflies, moths in our landscapes. Well, we must reduce soil fertility to allow wildflowers to thrive. And then when we've done that, we need to allocate those areas and look after them for nature. We can't just abandon them. And I think 2 things we must resist if we possibly can, and that is the just stop mowing. This picture here is of part of the park in Burgess Park in London, taken 2 years ago, and it is where mowing has just stopped to see what happened. And look, there are plenty of plenty of nectar sources there, and there's lots of creeping thistle and a bit of yarrow and wild carrot. It looks great, but present that to teams who are supposed to be managing the grass, and they'll turn around and say, well, how am I going to look after that? I don't have the kit to cut that. And that's the point, is that we need to get in and reduce soil fertility, because that will mean those wildflowers, perfectly acceptable wildflowers, but they'll grow a fraction of the height. The other thing I'm not so keen on, but I know, there are some values in it, is planting annual flower mixes. I think we all got to love the Olympic Park and the pictorial meadow mixes that were so much a wonderful joy to see, and they are beautiful and they're very engaging, but they do provide considerable sources of nectar for some parts of our insect fauna, but they really do not provide that much across the board in comparison with our perennial native wildflowers. So while they may be something that's about engaging people, we shouldn't think of cosmos and Californian poppy as the way out of our biodiversity crisis. We need to be concentrating on the species that are natives in this country, be those annuals or perennials, but they are really the ones that we should be heading towards. So if we are going to use annual flower mixes, we need to be explaining to people that these are paving the way for perennial mixes, which are the sustainable approach, because the maintenance of this sort of mix that you see, as was in the Olympic Park, is very expensive indeed. And what is noticeable, if you go back to the Olympic Park now, is the phenomenal effort. Fantastic how it looks now, because it is full of native perennials. So what was these pictorial meadow mixes that looked amazing have now been converted into all of those perennial wildflowers that you would love and expect to see in that area. Now, there are all sorts of issues associated with cut and collect, cut and lift. Probably the most significant of which is disposal of arisings. When Mark's back, he will talk to you about a very different and extremely good way of disposing of arisings. In Dorset, we don't have that luxury. So we've tended to dispose where they've been cut. Wherever we can, we dispose of road verge arisings in shelter belts, in bramble thickets, in new planting areas where the grass arisings can rot down, where they can be converted into growing matter where it doesn't matter, as in we can be converted into wood and trees and shrubs. So from my point of view, that's all I want to say now. Basically, we need to think of our amenity grassland, wherever it is, parks, open spaces, even in agricultural systems, we need to think of it as an ecosystem, because by thinking of that, we can think about how we control the grass growth in the first place and how to increase wildflower insects and insects on the back of that. Grasslands properly designed for wildlife are cheap and easy to create. And that's by incorporating low fertility soils into their design. And if you do so, the long-term costs are very, very slight indeed. We can retrofit through cut and collect. And if we do so, that drastically reduces the need for cutting, saves money, staff time, increases wildlife value, and almost without any seeding, common wildflowers and insects will start appearing, as they have done in all of the places where we've been doing this in Dorset, and certainly in the urban grasslands in Dorset, where this cut and collect, which is now most of the towns across Dorset, the standard cutting pattern of 5 to 6 times a year has been reduced just to 2 or 3. So they're talking about a 50% cut in the amount of labour and resources needed. Right, thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Phil.